Okay, this is Reading Adam. Adam with Reading Adam, Reading Edge Productions. Actually, I don't have an actual name for this, but this is Adam again. And today I'm bringing you this book, And Forgive Them Their Debts by Michael Hudson, Lending, Foreclosure, and Redemption from Bronze Age Finance to the Jubilee Year. This doesn't have to be a very long talk and discussion. Um, do I think you should buy the book? I don't think it's necessary. You can go on to Michael Hudson's website. You can basically, I think it's michaelhudson.com. He's an economist, and you can read plenty of his interviews and get the gist of what he's talking about. Basically, this book here, academic book, and it covers the history of debt cancellation. So why did I read this book about debt cancellation? Well, some of the economists, some of the intellectual people that I follow, brought up the idea of debt cancellation, particularly when Bernie Sanders originally discussed potentially eliminating student loan debt. And there's lots of controversy and discussion. Now, we live in a society where creditors, basically those who lend money to people, are the dominant class in our society today. There's nobody else. Debtors are not the dominant class. Debtors rarely have debt forgiven. Usually you have to have it forgiven in bankruptcy. Student loans, of course, you can't have forgiven in bankruptcy. And given the interest rate, given the massive amount of volume of loans, I think there's 1.6 trillion out right now, borrowed from the next generation and next two generations, millennials and Z, of course, X, and some boomers are still paying off loans, even from a long time ago. That's the power of interest and compound interest. So basically, this book details the origins of debt. He kind of discusses maybe where debt came from, and that's a complicated historical discussion in which I cannot reproduce in detail for you. That you, if you're interested, you would want to read the book. He talks about a bunch of different Bronze Age countries and kings. Um, you might have heard of Hammurabi. You might have that might have been the only one you heard of. Sargon. There's a few Greeks. There's surprising little. There isn't really debt cancellation in the Greek and Roman civilizations. There was one time in the Greek civilization, but and then of course the Jews in Judea. And I thought it was a very interesting book. There are a few things that I wanted to kind of touch on here. One, debt cancellation. I can't. I'm not. I don't know enough about the topic to comment. Rather, should we cancel debts? Should we cancel, or should we not? I guess. Let's be clear. Should we cancel debt? Should we not cancel debt? I do believe that student loan debts should be canceled, not just because I have my own, but student loans are predatory loans. They're high interest loans that cannot be discharged in bankruptcy. Somebody's stuck with them the rest of their life. And they are also, if they can never pay it back, their wages are garnished and they're just stuck with this debt forever to the end of their days, and that will definitely impact their retirement. It'll impact their ability to borrow money to buy a home. It might impact their emotional state enough where they never end up having much of a family. If they do have a family, they have less kids. They wait longer to have kids, therefore having less kids. I think it's very dangerous for society to have generations loaded with student debt if they will never end up forgiving that debt. I mean, the debt just gets larger and larger, the amount of money people have to borrow. And of course, in exchange for what? For a 4-year degree, which may or may not translate to a better job. I think it's been 20 years since I've gone to college the first time. The very first time I went to college, well, it's been 18 years, but it's almost been 20 years. In that amount of time, what have we had? We had one terrible economic downturn, 2007 and 8, with the housing financial bubble crisis. And then just now with the pandemic and another financial crisis, another economic collapse. Does it make sense to keep people saddled with debt? Because the point that Michael Hudson makes and people make when they're for debt cancellation was not very many people saying. I mean, like I said, Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump did forgive student loan debt for wounded veterans, I believe. So it's not like it's never happened. But the idea is, oh man, I just lost my train of thought. This happens a lot with me, so forgive me, bear with me a moment here. Getting the train back on the rails. Woo! That just happened. So, man, I wish I could think of what I want to do here. So I don't remember my point. I paused the video for a bit, tried to think about it. It's gone, whatever it was. I was discussing. So let's just. I should probably really have notes and not do this completely off the cuff. But anyways, let's get to what I kind of wanted to think about. A few points from this book that are I found to be interesting. So I guess I was discussing that I believe in student loan debt cancellation. In this book, I'm trying to slow myself down here, but in this book, Michael Hudson discusses that the debt cancellations from the Bronze Age were not commercial debt. It was just the debt of the private citizen masses. And there's a reason for that. I remember the point I wanted to make. Debt that cannot be repaid will not be repaid. So if you're working a part-time or maybe even full-time minimum wage job and you've got massive student loan debt that just keeps growing with interest rates, you cannot repay that. So it's never going to be repaid. What's going to happen is just you're going to be more of the money you do make is just going to go to this debt. Basically, it's never going. Although a lot of money you make will never go back into the goods and services of your local economy or society around you. So maybe you wanted to buy something, but you're not going to buy it, and that local company is not going to benefit from your purchase. And there's not going to be any taxes made off of that, because money that you spend on goods and services is also there's commercial tax, there's different taxes so the government gets some income back from that. But when you get a bunch of money and then you just throw it at your debt, that money basically disappears. So I do think that there should be debt cancellation for student loans. Yes, I'm biased, and as soon as a political candidate's like, "Yep, we'll write off all the debt for students, and it will be gone permanently," I will vote for that person, whatever they are. So there's that. Unabashedly biased for that because I have seen for myself, like, this is a debt I will never pay off unless I somehow get rich or strike rich. And what are the chances of that? The other thing, and for that times large with tons and tons of people. So forgiving debts, it's private debt. And the reason they did it in the Bronze Age, the reason why a Bronze Age, it happened whenever the new king took power. He immediately forgave debts. There was another time they forgave debts, which was in the case of a drought. Because back then, your debt was repaying the king in a portion of your crops, so or cattle or animals. But if there was a drought, if there was a famine, if there was a severe war or something, debt that cannot be paid will not be repaid. So what happens is the king who came into power forgave them that debt. And Michael Hudson describes they didn't do this out of the goodness of their hearts. They didn't do this out of any kind of altruistic motive. Why they did it is because what would happen if they did not? First off, they need these people to be. They need these people as soldiers in their army, and they need these people for services they can conduct, building things and whatever other services the king might need manpower for. It's in his interests that these people stay on their land, work their land, and then occasionally service the king in military capacity or in other capacities with labor. If he did not forgive the debts, what happened usually is the classes of wealthy landholders would eat up more land. They would become richer and richer. The poorer would be driven off their land, and then they would leave the country. Uh, who knows? Basically, their services wouldn't really be available to the king anymore. So what would happen is you'd go from a monarchy to an oligarchy where the rich controlled everything and then just continued to eat up all the land and everything in sight. And this typically weakened a country and left it open for invasion. And then the oligarchs would own everything. I mean, we kind of see this now with the 1% and the 99%. The 1% get wealthier and wealthier. They own and control more and more things. And then the rest of us are just getting poorer because more of our money is going towards the cost of a house to rent, or a mortgage, which is basically renting. In my opinion, a mortgage is you're just renting from the bank rather than a person. And rather than being evicted, the bank will kick you out of the house, foreclose on the home, and then sell it. It's, let's say you pay off your mortgage and you own the home. Well, what's going to happen if you can't pay? You can't afford the taxes on that home. Guess what? You're gone. So, or you go into tax arrears, and I don't know what else happens beyond that. But basically, like, you never really truly have your own property. And so in our society, what happened with the 2007-8 financial crisis when you had a bunch of subprime mortgages fail, people who had no business getting a mortgage, people would never be able to pay it back. And it was understood by the banks that they'd never be able to pay it back. And anyways, what happened is they evicted those people. They just took the homes and foreclosed on them, and people suffered, but the banks they got through it just fine because the federal government bailed them out, gave them like basically a blank check. The creditor classes end up eating up everything. Interest causes those who loan money to win in the long run because of collateral. If I give you a loan for $100,000 and you can't pay it back, well, then I get all your stuff. And then if I have a bunch of these other loans, because I'm usually not just loaning. If I can loan 100,000 to one person, I'm probably loaning 100,000 to 10,000 persons. And so I'm making more enough money where if you fail and then I just get your stuff and then I resell it, or I hold your assets, or something to gain income off your assets. Maybe I rent it out or something. You're still an income source to me. Like, I'm not hurting from that. But basically, the Bronze Age idea is kings had to forgive debt in order to retain the services of their citizens. If they didn't, a powerful nobility or oligarchy would take power. The king would lose power or just be the biggest of those guys, and eventually, you'd have problems in civilization, in the society there, of which I'm having difficulty articulating right now because I've only kind of studied this. It's not deeply understood by me. I'm just getting there. One thing that interested me about why I bought this book, why I want to read it, as you see in the picture there, he has a picture of Jesus whipping the money changers in the temple. And the thing that was interesting to me, and I have to delve more deeply into this, and I do have a note from a while back that I put on my phone here. But basically, one thing that interested me in this is that Jesus Christ, in his very first sermon, when he pointed to some passage in Isaiah, maybe Isaiah 61, he described that he was bringing back the Jubilee. The Jubilee, the Debt Jubilee, so the argument is made in this book, and it's pretty compelling, but the Debt Jubilee is the good news. The good news for everyone. And then people at that time believed they were in the end time because it was a time period of severe debt crisis where the creditors were taking over everything. And Jesus was bringing back the Debt Jubilee because there was a guy, Hillel, I believe was his name, who put a clause into the Debt Jubilee that basically when people took out an interest-bearing loan, they waived their right to a Debt Jubilee. So they were getting by without the Debt Jubilee, and this was causing more and more people to suffer from debt, and they were losing more and more of their property and everything because of the not being able to pay back interest. So it was it's interesting to me because the Debt Jubilee was the good news that Jesus was bringing back. The kingdom of God was kind of must have been basically the Debt Jubilee. For his prayer, forgive us our debts, is literal debts, not some spiritual sin debt. It's a literal financial debt, sort of like his prayer of give us our daily bread is literal bread. It's to be able to eat every day, and um, there's a lot of verses here for you to check out if you're a little bit curious, maybe skeptical. Leviticus 25 and Luke 4. Mark 6, Matthew 18, Leviticus 19, verse 18, Isaiah 61, Matthew chapter 5, verses 3 through 6, Luke chapter 6, verses 20 through 22, and Luke 6, verse 35. I just left a note to myself here, lend without expecting repayment. So that was a big reason why I had gotten this book, because I was interested in finding out more about what did Jesus mean with forgiving their debts, and has there been a major point in Christianity that has been missed for millennia, that debt is really just, Jesus was trying to bring back the debt amnesty tradition. So let me just read a paragraph from you here, and I quote. This is from the introduction, chapter 1. Jesus' first sermon, the tradition of debt amnesty. This might explain it slightly better. In the first reported sermon Jesus delivered upon returning to his native Nazareth in Luke 4, he unrolled the scroll of Isaiah and announced his mission to restore the year of our Lord. Until recently, the meaning of this phrase was not recognized as referring specifically to the Jubilee year, but breakthroughs in cuneiform research and a key Qumran scroll provide a direct link to that tradition. This linkage provides a basis for understanding how early Christianity emerged in an epoch so impoverished by debt and the threat of bondage that it was called the end time. Jesus was both more revolutionary and more conservative than was earlier recognized. He was politically revolutionary in threatening Judaic creditors. That's probably why he was killed. And behind them, the Pharisees who had rationalized their rights against debtors. Luke 16, 13 through 15 describes them as loving money and sneering at Jesus' message that you cannot serve both God and money, or / mammon. The leading rabbinical school in an age where when creditor power was gaining dominance throughout the ancient world, the Pharisees followed the teachings of Hillel. Now credited as a founder of rabbinical Judaism, he sponsored the Prosbul clause, in which creditors obliged their clients to waive their rights to have their debts canceled in the Jubilee year. Jesus' call for a Jubilee year was conservative in resurrecting the economic ideal central to Mosaic law: widespread annulment of personal debts. This ideal remains so alien to our modern way of thinking that his sermons are usually interpreted in a broad, compassionate sense of urging personal charity towards one's own debtors and the poor in general. There is a reluctance to focus on the creditor oligarchy that Jesus and many of his contemporary Romans blamed for the epoch's deepening poverty. So, and then he goes into discussing like this Hebrew word deror, used in Leviticus to signal a debt cancellation in the Jubilee year. So basically, fascinating stuff that Jesus was actually trying to bring back. He was against the Pharisees and the leaders in Jerusalem there, because he wanted to bring back the Jubilee. People were in debt. They were falling into bondage to their debt. And that probably was why he was killed. Because the history of civilization in the West has been, on the one side, you have the creditors, the creditor class, those in power, and the debtors. And these two have been fighting each other ever since, because debt leads to slavery, bondage. I mean, think of the student loan thing again. Students right now, or people who have graduated, and people who have student loans, they're not free. They're in bondage to that loan until it's repaid. You must work until that's repaid. They can take your Social Security. They can take 15% of your wages. They can take all of your tax returns. People are just lucky they're not thrown into debtor's prison anymore. But it's you can't escape it. Okay, I think there's something like, if you go on the income repayment for like 30 or 40 years, for a long time, basically most of your working career, then your loans will be forgiven at the end of it. But that's after they've drawn that's like an extra tax on your wages for who knows how long. What if you become disabled in that time? What if you can't work anymore? What if you just are, you went to school, but you weren't that smart, you weren't that bright, and maybe you were, but just for reasons like a pandemic, the economy collapses and you can't get meaningful employment. What then? What then? Do we just ignore these people? Are these people just forever in bondage to their student loans that they cannot discharge in bankruptcy? It's ludicrous. It's ridiculous. It's one way to ensure that the next generations are literally not going to have very many kids, and literally not carry on the civilization that we once knew, because there's not going to be the same amount of families. So you would want to forgive their debt, get them out of the debt, just to keep civilization going. Because after a while, you run out of borrowers. After a while, you run out of people you can get loans off of. And the 1%, who cares how rich they get? They're not ever going to be an economy in and of themselves, even though they have the GDP of many nations. So that's just kind of some stuff I want to talk about with this book, and Forgive Them Their Debts, title of the book, by Michael Hudson. It's interesting. It's thought-provoking. I do think this has to be discussed. I think there's no way to avoid discussing debt cancellation. And I know a lot of people are terrified of the ramifications of what would happen if debt was suddenly canceled. And I'm not in I have not studied this enough to know how to answer that. But what I can say is, debt that cannot be repaid will not be repaid. And they try to have it repaid anyway by garnishing your wages. The bankruptcy is, well, they're going to seize your assets. You're left destitute with nothing. You have to start completely over. So there's not. It's where we live in weird times, right? With the pandemic, crashing our economy. We live in very weird times, and I don't know how we're going to get out of this. But debt cancellation is something to consider. It might actually be beneficial. And from there, I will end it, and learn more about this on your own. Discover it. You can read. Like I said, you can read this book by Michael Hudson. It's not very long. I read it slowly, so it took me like a week to read. But you can. It's worth it. It's worth your time to read. It's worth it having some discussions with your Christian friends about forgiving debts, and what Jesus was bringing back, or with your atheist friends, the Bronze Age, the non-Christian, the non-Jewish folks who were doing debt jubilee. Like those civilizations lasted for a long time doing that, and there is evidence that they actually did it. So that's one thing he addresses here as well, because some people say, well, it was an ideal, but they didn't actually do it. But he's saying they actually did do that, and there's some interesting information on that. Okay, so I'm ending this. Thank you for listening to this and possibly considering what's going on here. And this is Adam again, signing off. Goodbye.